So tenant is nothing but a Workday environment actually. So where we actually work. Okay. Tenant is a term that we typically call instance that we work in Workday. Okay. So a Workday instance is nothing but a tenant. Okay. So there is a separate kind of practice called the tenant management in Workday practice actually. So generally, people who are project managers, people who are the lead project leads and all, they'll be having this kind of responsibilities to take care of tenants actually, typically called as tenant management. Okay. Okay. So Workday tenants are multiple actually. Okay. So we have first one called production tenant. Second one called Sandbox. Third one called implementation tenant. Fourth one called Sandbox Preview. Okay, these are the typical four type of tenants that will be working actually. So these are the four tenants that we generally work. Okay, so when you're working in real tenants, these are live tenants actually. Okay, so whatever the production tenant is there, right? This production tenant is a live tenant where all the live transactions will be performed. Okay, your hiring, terminations, job data transactions like promotions, title changes, transfers, all these kind of things. Whatever in other modules like leave module, leave configuration, and all, everything goes into production after testing, after implementing, everything goes into production. So typically, production is a live tenant. We typically call it as, and all the live transactions will be performed in a production tenant. Okay. And we also call it as a gold tenant also. Okay. Production tenant is also called as a gold tenant. Okay. So other than this production tenant, other team members, other users like end user or business user, other folks in the organization will not have any access to these tenants. Sandbox tenant, implementation tenant, Sandbox Preview. They at least don't know what it is. Even they'll be not aware of even this also, the behavior of. They'll just be using as a user. They'll be viewing their HR information, their comp, their benefits. All they'll be using as a kind of employee, like as an end user. They'll be using Workday, but you all being as a kind of Workday team members, you will be working on a configurations or as a kind of developer in Workday technical areas. Okay. Since these are the responsibilities that you'll be performing, and that's why today you're here to learn all these things. You will be getting access for all these things. Okay. The first day when you join any real any customer organization, you'll be getting access to all these four tenants. Okay. So there is a purpose of getting access to these four tenants. Okay, because you are part of Workday team and you will be taking care of complete Workday application. You will be getting access to all these four Workday tenants actually. Okay, the reason why other folks who are part of any other. So what I was referring is so other folks like end users, business users. Okay, so who will be working outside of Workday platform. Okay, they'll not have access to these all these applications. Okay, so they'll be as a kind of employee in the gold tenant or in the live tenant. That's it. Okay, so they can view their compensation, they can view their data, they can view all their self-service activities, they can perform or all the HR activities in their production tenant. Okay, so because that's what the employee has to do. Okay, so we'll provide all the access that employee requires in production tenant, which they can perform. And other tenant access, regular employee will not have, because they don't need. Why do they need the Sandbox tenant access or implementation tenant access or Sandbox Preview? They don't need, right? Because they'll be not configuring anything. They'll not be developing anything. They don't need anything. Only Workday team members will be requiring all these things. Okay, the reason why is you will be performing a configuration. You will be part of any of a module implementation. You will be developing a brand new report or brand new integration. Okay, so before you do that in production, you have to do that in non-production tenant to ensure that that is working as per requirement and meeting the needs of the business. Okay, so to do that, you can utilize any of these tenants actually. Okay, these are all non-production tenant, I can say. Okay, non-production tenant where you can actually do any kind of testing, any kind of the configuration that you're doing for the first time which might go wrong. Okay, then you can correct these things, but in production you cannot do wrong. Okay, because that's a live tenant, right? And that will impact business actually. So all the once you ensure that everything is working fine in non-production tenant, you will be moving that configuration to production. Until then, you will be using any of these tenants for your testing, configuration, development. Once everything is finalized, you will move that to production. Okay. So by this time, you understood that all these three tenants are typically used for developing and configurations. Okay. But these three tenants have specific features actually that you need to know. Okay. We know all these three are non-production tenants. Okay. But these three has specific features and specific behavior that we need to understand. Okay. Sandbox tenant. Okay. Sandbox tenant is typically used for last level of testing. Okay. Last level of testing that you will be performing before you move that configuration or before you move that technical task to production. Okay. So sandbox tenant is typically used for, is a test tenant, we typically call it as, and it is used for last level of testing. Okay, why? The reason I'm saying it can be used for last level of testing is any time or when you start any kind of huge development work or huge configuration work, you prefer to do that in implementation tenant. Okay, not directly in sandbox tenant. We are talking about environment where we typically work when we get into Workday position. Okay, it's nothing but where you start your working. So any kind of requirements that you get from business, okay, any kind of activities that you have to do, you do in an environment. That environment is typically called as a tenant actually. Okay, and that tenant is classified into multiple types. Okay, so whatever you're seeing on my screen, one is the production tenant where you actually do a kind of a live activities. Okay, that is typically used for live transactions. Okay, so when employee joins in the tenant, okay, when employee gets terminated, when employee is getting promoted from one position to other position, when employee job title is getting changed, all these are kind of general things that will typically happen in a HR system, right? So those are performed in a live tenant, and that live tenant is a production tenant, also named as a gold tenant. Okay, so are you clear with this? Any questions you have?
No, okay.
Okay. Yes. And to perform any kind of live transaction, we go with production tenant. Outside of that, we have other three types of tenants, okay, which generally you get access because you'll be working in a Workday team. Okay. No other team member outside of Workday platform will be getting access to these three tenants because no other team member will not be doing any kind of configuration, any kind of development work in Workday application. That's the reason why they will not be getting access to these three tenants actually. Okay. So these three tenants are typically named as a non-production tenants. Okay. Non-production tenants in the sense live transactions will not be performed in these three tenants. Okay. So these three are non-production tenants. Okay. So when you hire in any after this course, when you get hired into any Workday position, okay, so if that organization is using Workday as their HRI system, you get hired into this tenant actually. Okay, your hire process will go in production tenant. Okay, your job title will be in production tenant. Okay, your manager will be assigned first in production tenant. All your job transactions, okay, your your position, job profile, okay, if you wanted to submit any kind of goals and all, everything will happen in production, not on these three tenants. Okay. That's at end user perspective. But coming to these three tenants, right? Sandbox tenant, implementation tenant, and Sandbox Preview, we have a kind of different need that we need to consider whenever we wanted to perform any kind of configuration or any kind of development in these three tenants. Let's say Sandbox. Okay, Sandbox is one of the testing tenant which you'll be considering to perform your configuration or to test your configuration or to test your development work, either reporting or any kind of integrations. Last level of testing you do before you deploy into production. Okay, so Sandbox tenant is typically used for testing only. Okay, but whenever you're doing a kind of huge implementations, you cannot do that in Sandbox tenant. The reason why is it can hold data for only 1 week. Okay, Sandbox tenant can hold the data only for 1 week. After 1 week, all the production data will get again copied to Sandbox. So every weekend, if you remember the folks who have attended last demo session, every weekend, end of Friday, Workday will be going down. Okay, so Workday will be going for maintenance activity. Okay, for 2 hours or 3 hours or 4 hours, so Workday will be going for maintenance activity. During that time, all these 4 tenants will not be available for you. Okay, when Workday is going for maintenance activity, these 4 tenants will not be available for you. Either it can be 3 hours or 4 hours, maximum 5 to 6 hours only. Okay, so that duration you'll not be able to access these tenants. Okay, and as part of that maintenance activity every week, all the production data that sits in production tenant will get copied to Sandbox. Okay, so we'll get copied to Sandbox, and Sandbox will get refreshed from production with the data that sits in production. Okay, so meaning that every transaction that happens in production tenant, end of Friday, that will get copied to Sandbox. So we typically call Sandbox tenant as a week back production tenant. Though it is not a live tenant, but all the production data will get copied to Sandbox end of Friday. So next week, the next Monday, when we actually log into the Sandbox tenant, we will see all the last week transaction that happened in production in Sandbox tenant. Okay, so that is the reason why we typically call Sandbox as a week back production tenant. Okay, so and coming back to, I'll hold it for a few minutes to give any kind of to take any kind of questions you guys have. But let me complete one small thing. Where I started. Why you will not do huge implementations in Sandbox is because it will get refreshed every week from production. Okay, so when your implementation is going more than a week, all the work that you have done in that particular week will be waste. Okay, that will go off. All the data will go off from Sandbox as part of weekend maintenance activity. That's the reason why huge implementations will not go in production. Instead, that will go in implementation tenant. Okay, I'll talk about implementation tenant in a while, but I wanted to see everyone are clear with Sandbox tenant. Anyone have any questions?
If it is refreshed every week, can we transfer the data on the last day to a different instance and then let it refresh, and then again we migrate back to that?
Yeah,
so we don't lose the work.
Yeah, you can do that. Okay, so let's say if you're working,
is it a big job?
No, it's not a big job. It's in minutes of time. It's just selecting your target tenant, do a kind of migration. That's it. Okay.
So we can do that.
Yeah, you can do that. Okay, that flexibility, but you have. But only the thing is, testing. When you're doing any kind of testing, okay, the testing is not completed in a week. Okay, so there you need to have some kind of other decisions. But there is all during that duration also you have an option actually. Okay, you can go to Workday and place a request with Workday. We are doing some implementation or some testing, so we don't want to have data to lose because of this refresh. Hold on the refresh for this week. Okay, we can place a request with Workday and Workday will consider that request and will exempt the maintenance or refresh activity for that particular week. So you can place continuously 2 requests with Workday. Okay, continuously 2 requests you can make, and you can exempt 2 refreshes. But the third thing Workday will not accept. Automatically, it will get refreshed. So you have an option at any kind of emergency or any kind of critical, implementation that you're doing where you cannot take a backup and your testing will lose. No, during that scenarios, you can exempt refresh for 2 weeks and you can continue what all you're doing. But during that maintenance window, anyways, your tenant will not be available. Though your data will not go from Sandbox, but there will be a maintenance window every weekend. During that weekend, you'll not be having access to tenants for 2 or 3 hours. Okay, but after that, if you're exempted with the Sandbox refresh, your data will still be there. You can now resume your work where you stopped. Yeah, so you have a flexibility to place a request with Workday for exemptions. If not, you can take a backup if those are reports or any kind of integrations which are easy to migrate to other tenant. But whereas some configurations, right, will not have a migration option. You need to recreate another tenant. Okay, so those kind of cases, probably you need to think of whether you go for refresh or you go for exemption. You need to think of.
Okay.
A quick question, Samadhi.
Yeah.
I'm just trying to understand this part, the deployment part. So if I go in Sandbox tenant, make few workflow changes or whatever changes, which I'm planning to deploy in production, say next week, next Monday, right? So how do I move that code from Sandbox tenant to production on Monday? Because everything is being refreshed on Friday. You know what I'm saying? I mean, I'm just trying to understand the deployment process.
So before getting refreshed, only you need to plan. Okay. Or if you have a plan to do that only on Monday, not before refresh, you can take that backup into another downstream tenant. Okay, because that will get refreshed. And once the refresh is completed, you can deploy that back to Sandbox, do a kind of smoke test, and migrate it to production. That is one option. Or the other option is, if you don't want to have the data to get wiped off from Sandbox, okay, place a request with Workday for Sandbox exemption request, and your data will not go off.
Got it. Thank you.
Just a quick thing is like how many times we can raise a request with Workday regarding pausing our getting refresh Sandbox tenant?
2 times.
No, that is consecutive 2 times, but apart from that.
So there is no limit actually. So if you have completed 2 times, so after another refresh, if you have another week you wanted to exempt, you can place a request. There is no limit on that. But Workday only accept continuous 2 requests.
Yeah, continuation too. But yes, there is there any like permission tracker or something like which we
there is no permission tracker. You'll be getting a kind of a resource center application access, where I said, right, a tenant manager who will be taking care of these responsibilities. That person will be getting access to resource center access, where you can raise a case with Workday. Okay, there you have an option to raise a case for Workday tenants. Actually, there is a separate platform for tenants. You can actually place a request there that you wanted to exempt a Sandbox refresh.
Okay, thank you. And I have one more question, Amit. Can you a little more explain this implementation tenant?
Yeah, we are getting into implementation tenant. Yeah. So everyone clear with Sandbox and production? Anyone have any questions in Sandbox and production? Okay. So implementation tenant. Okay. So Sandbox and Sandbox Preview, production tenant, customer will get as part of product subscription. Okay. So when they subscribe for Workday, customer will get these 3 tenants: production, Sandbox, and Sandbox Preview by default actually. Okay. But implementation tenant is not part of subscription. Every customer has to purchase additionally. Okay, they need to invest on implementation tenant. Okay, and it depends upon the headcount. Okay, so it depends upon the headcount. It depends upon the number of projects that customer is managing. So it depends upon that. A customer can have number of tenants actually. Okay, one tenant, two tenants, more than 5, 6, 7. Number of tenants depends upon the headcount, depends upon the demand of the project they manage, and when they have a capable of investing on each tenant, they can purchase. For recent, one of the customers that I have supported for international implementation, they had around 8 implementation tenants. Okay, in 8 implementation tenants, 2 implementation tenants were specifically used for brand new implementations, and other 5 are typically used for their recurring projects like performance management, compensation review process, benefit open enrollment. These are recurring projects there, right? For each project, they have a kind of dedicated tenant where they'll be using those dedicated implementation tenants during that particular projects. Okay, so implementation tenant will not be a part of subscription. Every customer has to purchase. Okay, so they can have a small scale customer can have one implementation tenant, or if they don't have budget to even invest on implementation tenant, they can actually keep this out from their tenant strategies. Okay, they can only have production, sandbox, and sandbox preview. Okay, so that's the kind of ideal thing that you can see. But the purpose of implementation tenant, or the reason why we can typically use implementation tenant is whenever we are going for brand new implementations. Okay, so Workday gives us, or if you have a number of implementation tenants, you can use those implementation tenants, because implementation tenant will not get refreshed every week. Every weekend, all the data from implementation tenant will not get wiped off, and all the production data that gets into implementation tenant does not happen every week. Okay, here it will happen every week by default. So you place a request if you wanted to exempt, because based on your project demand actually. But implementation tenant, it will not get refreshed every week. You need to place a request with Workday that you wanted to have implementation tenant refreshed from production based on your requirement. Until then, it will not get refreshed. Okay. When you place a request with Workday that we wanted to have implementation tenant, since it is old tenant, 1 year back we got refreshed, we wanted to have latest data in implementation tenant, let's have a refresh for implementation tenant from production. If you have that kind of request you place with Workday, Workday will be refreshing this implementation tenant. All the production data will be copied to implementation tenant just based on your request. Okay, so until you place a request, this will not get refreshed. So that is the reason why any kind of huge kind of project work, huge kind of configuration enhancement work that you'll be doing, or brand new implementation that you'll be performing will be from implementation tenant. You start with implementation tenant. Okay, so do some kind of first level of configuration or development. After that, do some kind of testing. Then move that to another implementation tenant. If you have, do end-to-end testing there. After end-to-end testing, move that to sandbox, which will take within a week or 2 weeks. Okay, do that the testing in sandbox, last level of testing, and then move for production as part of go live activity. Okay, that's the purpose of implementation tenant. Okay, so refresh will happen based on customer request. Here, refresh will happen based on the Workday standards. Okay. Anyone have any questions on implementation tenant? Okay, I'll take that as a no. So now coming to Sandbox Preview. Okay, as I said, Sandbox Preview is part of product subscription actually. Okay, by default, you get, when you subscribe for Workday, Sandbox Preview will be part of your default tenants actually. Okay. Now, this we know is typically used for last level of testing, and we have every week refresh by default for Sandbox. Okay, and this implementation, and we typically do huge kind of implementations or any kind of enhancement configuration you do with the implementation tenant, because every week it will not get refreshed, and it's a separate tenant where with separate cost customer would have invested, and based on their demand, a number of tenants customer can have. Whereas Sandbox Preview, it is a kind of default tenant, but the purpose of Sandbox Preview is for performing release testing. Okay, so Workday undergoes release for every 6 months. Okay, for every 6 months, Workday undergoes release activity where it converts from one version to other version. Earlier, 3 or 4 years back, we used to have version numbers. Okay, Workday 31, Workday 32, 33, 34, 35. We used to have version numbers actually. But from last, I think 2 years back, Workday changed this one. Okay, they've changed version numbers to R1 and R2 kind of concept. Okay, they've got 2024 R1 in the sense Workday is in release 1 activity. Okay, 2024 R2, which is in the sense we are in 2024 release 2 activities. So first half you'll be in R1, and second half you'll be undergoing R2 application, where you'll be experiencing some new features for every 6 months that Workday will be launching. Okay, whenever you get that new features, all those new features first gets moved to Sandbox Preview. Okay, 1 month before, let's say in the month of March, Workday will be getting into Workday goes live with new features. Okay, before it goes live in the month of March, in the month of Feb, Workday will be moving all the new features to Sandbox Preview. Okay, and in the month of September, R2 will happen. Sorry, August, R2 will happen, and before 1 month, all those R2 features will go to Sandbox Preview. So 1 month time, Workday will give for customers to review all the new features to see whether new features are impacting any of the existing features. Okay, so you do some kind of impact analysis with all the new features in 1 month of time in Sandbox Preview. Then, if there are no complaints, if there are no escalations, if there are no cases that Workday gets, Workday will move all those new features to production automatically. Okay, customer resource involvement will not be here. Everything will be taken care by Workday. All we need to do is test what Workday is giving, utilize what Workday is giving. That's it. Okay, so once we are sure that all the new features that Workday has given are not impacting, Workday will take those to production tenant. Workday will be giving a kind of scheduled dates. On this date, R1 will go live. On this date, R2 will go live. So such kind of dates will give. On that date, your Sandbox Preview, whatever the new features that you got, will move to production. Okay. So Sandbox Preview is typically used for release testing. Okay, so whenever Workday moves to new feature, new version, or it upgrades to one release activity, all the new features of that particular release activity will be validated and will be tested before those goes to production. Okay, 95%, you'll not be seeing any kind of issues with the new features, but hardly 1% or 2% cases. Sometimes the new features that Workday will be offering might impact any of the existing or might not be meeting the business needs. Sometimes you'll feel that. Okay, so when you see that, when you reach out to Workday will take care of that feature, will be holding off for that release, or will be fixing the issue and will be re-releasing that feature. Actually, that might happen, but in very rare cases you could see. I hardly saw one time, but rest of all other things, whatever new feature that Workday has given have worked promptly as how they have to. Okay. So Sandbox Preview, as I said, right, it is typically used for release testing. And the Sandbox Preview, since it is used for only release testing, Workday has given less space for Sandbox Preview than these 3 tenants. Okay, the memory or the kind of space that Sandbox Preview has is little less than these 3 live tenants. Okay, so that's the reason why you will be noticing little performance issue or performance lag when you compare with these 3 tenants. When you have a report that is looking for, or that is fetching around the 1 lakh or 2 lakhs employee data, okay, including both active and terminated employees. When report is returning 2 lakhs of data, and in all these three tenants, if the report is completing in 2 minutes, okay, but when you run the same report in Sandbox Preview, it might take 3 minutes or 4 minutes, because the performance is not similar as other tenants for Sandbox Preview. Okay, so the space or the kind of resources that Workday has granted for Sandbox Preview might be little less than these three tenants. Some customers, who will be not having budget to implement on implementation tenant, they'll be using Sandbox Preview for first level of configuration or first level of any kind of enhancement. They'll do in Sandbox Preview and then move that to Sandbox. Even Sandbox Preview also will not be getting refreshed every week. Okay, it will be getting refreshed by the request of customer, and only during release times for every 6 months. I said, right, March and September release will happen, right? During that time, your Sandbox Preview will get refreshed actually. Okay, so only during that particular time it will be getting refreshed automatically. Rest of all of the times, until customer places request, it will not get refreshed. So most of the small scale customers who are not able to invest on implementation tenant, they'll typically use Sandbox Preview as a kind of similar tenant for any kind of backup related activities. Anything, they can use Sandbox Preview. Yeah. You cannot identify that, but identically, you'll be seeing the performance will be little low than other three tenants, because the other three tenants have decent space based on the headcount Workday has granted. But since this Sandbox Preview is typically not used for any kind of implementation or huge testing, this is typically used for release testing. Considering this, Workday has Workday will be assigning less resources for Sandbox Preview, and that's where you see little performance low than other three tenants. It will not be huge, it will not even identify also, but ideally, you should be, if you're running a huge report, probably you'll be seeing in a minute variation actually. Sandbox tenant will be as part of product subscription. Only implementation tenant customer has to purchase additionally. Sandbox tenant will be customer will be getting by default when they subscribe for Workday product. Sandbox and Sandbox Preview, production tenant, these three tenants by default they get. Only in case if they wanted to have additionally for project management, for any kind of other implementation that they are undergoing, they can invest on implementation tenant and do those activities in it. Okay. Any other questions anyone have? Okay. So that would be a kind of information that you need to know about tenants. Okay. So when you join any of the Workday customer organization, you will be getting access for all these things. Okay. So you should be aware that Sandbox will be getting refreshed every week, so that you can prepare for data backup if you're working on any of the small enhancements, small activities, to take a backup in other tenant before it gets refreshed actually. Okay. So this managing tenants also is kind of activity that senior role people will be managing actually. So getting Sandbox refresh exempt, or placing a refresh for implementation tenant, or if there are multiple implementation tenant, taking care of refreshing those tenants so that all the tenants will have a latest data at least.
Hello.
Hello, I'm not able to hear anything.
You're not able to hear me?
Oh, now yes.
Yeah. So what I was referring is, anytime when you're working on any kind of small enhancements, any kind of small configuration work, that can go in Sandbox. But whereas implementation tenant, where it takes more than a week, okay, more than a week of development work or configuration work, okay, or a huge integration that you are developing, which takes more than a week. So ideally, you should have some tenant, that should hold that work more than a week, right? So in those cases, you can actually prefer implementation tenant. If you don't have any implementation tenant, you can prefer Sandbox Preview. Okay. So that's about tenants that we have. So typically the managers, senior managers, project managers, they'll be controlling these things because these are just operational stuff, right? Reaching out to Workday and placing a request, exempting a tenant refresh, all these kind of things they'll be taking care. Okay. So person who will be managing these tenants will need to be coordinating with all the business users, managing their tenants refreshes and all. The person will be taking care. Okay. And ensure that at least for every 6 months, your tenant is getting refreshed.